I'm Joe Crandall, and now that you guys have eaten, we're actually here to talk about timeshares. So there's some high-pressure salesman right outside the door, and it's MLMs. No, so yeah, so I've been in the industry about 12 years now, done a lot of infrastructure, a lot of cloud stuff, and so it's really good to talk about DR because I think, for a show of hands, how many of you have a disaster recovery plan at your organization that you're aware of? In theory, yeah. Good point. It's all up here. That's another one. Do you actually, a show of hands, do you actually have a DR system in place today? So it's one thing to have it on paper, ready to go, but it's another thing to say, hey, we can fail over at any time. Couple? Portions, partial. So we're going to talk a little bit about today one of the tools that Microsoft has for disaster recovery, and hopefully this may help you see at least what's available out there. So back to the question about disaster recovery, how many people use a backup solution today in their environment? And it's products like Commvault or VMware Site Recovery Manager or BDP, VMware Data Protection, Symantec. There's a lot of them out there, right? Does it have the capability to also do disaster recovery? So, for example, you could have a VM on one environment and then immediately power it up on the other. Anyone have a product that does something like that, like Zerto? Okay, great. Okay, so there's a wide range of people here. Yeah. So, who has had a disaster? It can be human-caused disaster as well. So I'll share my experience. This was about 8 months ago. Not my fault. That's not why I'm here today. Just so you know. We were just doing some standard maintenance on our data center. Most of our company was on premises, so we had a data center. We did a lot of VMware. And we brought some contractors in to run additional power up to a networking closet on a second floor. And so we're like, this is low risk. It went through our CAB, like minimal impact, no big deal, right? Well, we had one of the contractors pulling the power line through the conduit between floors. And as the wire came out, it arced across one of the breakers and took out power for the whole data center. And so the first question you think when you're sitting at your desk is, hey, why can't I get out to the internet? Like, that's really what matters, right? I can't get out to the internet. We can't call, our phone system's down, like it's just completely down. You start seeing customers coming to your desk saying, hey, I can't get out to the internet. It's not, I can't get my mail, it's just I can't get out to the internet. And so we realized there's a problem. We go over there and it's just dark, right? Air conditioners are off, it's pitch dark, the door won't open because it's a mag door. So, you know, we pop a hole through it and we're in and it's just dark. So we get everything back up and we don't have a DR solution. We have nothing. There is nothing there to continue business if that data center burnt to the ground. So fortunately it didn't burn to the ground, but so we're freaking out. They get the power back on. We're back at our desk. We're powering up VMware, making sure the SAN's working and making sure people can get out to the internet because like I said, we all know as soon as they get out to the internet, the call volume just drops off the cliff. And we get it all up and running. We're like, this is great. What the hell happened? And so we want to make sure the UPSs are okay because they didn't go off either. And so we bring in a different contractor, and I kid you not, he goes to test them and he forgets to switch the breaker over and the data center goes down again. And so this is like 4 hours in, we're like, stuff's still not functioning. But again, right? Where'd the internet go? We go back over there, same thing. It's all off. Start powering stuff up again, and we're a lot faster the second time, right? Because we just did this. Like we just had a full DR failover test, and so it took about 4 or 5 hours the first time. It took about 6 hours the second time because we went to 100%. But you know, those are things that you can avoid with a good DR plan. And so I'm going to go ahead and I do have a slideshow. I'm going to try and keep this as minimal as possible because I really hate slideshows. And I'm going to do a lot of demos here. So Microsoft has a product, and how many of you have VMware in your environment? Great. Hyper-V? Anyone with Hyper-V? Okay, great. So I actually tailored this primarily towards VMware, and the good news is Azure Site Recovery supports VMware. And your first question is going to be, does Steve Ballmer approve of this? And he probably didn't. They actually bought a company that does a lot of this, and they've integrated it into the cloud. So Azure Site Recovery allows you to install a few agents, whether using VMware or Hyper-V, and the experience with Hyper-V is a little bit easier than VMware. And then you can instantly use your snapshot system already in place and replicate those VMs up to the cloud. And then you can create runbooks, you can do automation, you can configure it to where, hey, if I want to fail over an individual machine, or hey, this place burnt to the ground, I can fail over the whole system, and users can be up and running in no time. There's a couple of items I wanted to talk about too. And you guys may or may not have seen this before, but when we talk about backup and restore, there are two big items we like to talk about, RPO and RTO. RPO is how far back in time the business is willing to allow data to be stale. So when we look at backup solutions or recovery solutions, the first question should always be, how much data loss is the business willing to tolerate? And that defines the cost of any type of solution, right? So if they say, hey, we don't want to tolerate anything, we want it to be now, tell your upper manager, hey, this is going to be expensive, right? Because it's going to be a nice, juicy check. There's vendors out there that are going to just love you. If the RPO is 15 minutes or 30 minutes or a day or 2 days or whatever, that's when the cost starts to go down. RTO is the time it takes for you to recover from the outage. So let's say, like in my scenario, when that data center went down, burned down to the ground, or went out from power, RTO is the time it took us to get back up to where the business could function without losing money. And so in our case, that was a day, reality.
That was your planned RTO? That's what the reality was.
Yeah, that was.
You define RPO again?
Yep. Recovery, so RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective. And in the backup, recovery, archive world, it just means how long you're willing to let the data be stale. So perfect scenario, let's say you have a server crash and you want to restore from a backup, and you only take backups of every day, let's say at midnight or whatever, that VM. Yeah, is that acceptable or not? The business will, right, the business when they're, and this is, ironically, this is how this works, I'm guessing with most of you guys, you'll go to the business and say, how long can you wait for the business, or for the data, how far back can the data be stale? And they'll say, oh, you know, it's no big deal. It's no big deal. If it's a day or whatever, we're good. Until that server goes down, and now they're like, hey, we can't lose anything. This is mission critical. So you'll get that as well. And I want to talk a little bit about, and the first thing that we talk about with Azure as well is costs. And I'm going to pull up a quick spreadsheet here. So Microsoft has a tool that we can go ahead and run. It's called the Site Recovery Deployment Manager. What this does, and we'll go back here, is that you run it on your environment. So you spin up a VM if you're in VMware. If you're in Hyper-V, you can run it on a VM as well. You'll give it some parameters. You'll say, hey, here's the VMs I want to protect. Here's my network constraints. Here's how long I want you to watch what I'm doing on these machines. And it'll spit out this pretty report after 7 days or 30 days or 20 days of analysis of your environment. This is probably one of the best tools I've seen for trying to figure out exactly how much Azure is going to cost you in reality. Because I think that's the biggest thing with Azure is, hey, we've got all this infrastructure we want to put up there, and it feels like it's a nickel and diming event, right? And so here, this is my VMware environment. I went ahead and set this up on my home lab. And I decided, hey, I want to go ahead and do 5 machines. This screen. And as part of the PowerPoint, I've listed out links to all the documents I've used, as well as the tools and any additional information, like how to configure this tool, how to run Site Recovery Manager, and we'll share that with you guys at the end. But so I went ahead and said, hey, I want to do these 5 machines. I want to go ahead and it'll tell me how many cores I need up in Azure, and it'll tell you, hey, by the way, there's going to be some limitations here. You need to click here and talk to support to get that lifted. It'll say, here's how long it's going to take me to hit my objective of 15 minutes. And so I did configure this for 15 minutes. I didn't want to lose any more than 15 minutes of my kids' Minecraft data. That was super critical to us. So I said, during this initial one, and this is a slight difference I'll get into later, VMware does require an on-premise infrastructure server to do some of the processing before it ships it up to Azure. Hyper-V does not have that requirement. So it says, hey, I have one configuration server is required right now. As you get more VMs and you run this configuration tool, it'll say, hey, you need one configuration server and one additional process server. The other options, it says, hey, how much bandwidth if I get, how long can I achieve 15-minute RPO? And then it says, hey, if you're going to start backing up these solutions, here's how many machines you can do with this much bandwidth and how much you can get them all up there within 72 hours. So as you can tell, it would take me 4 meg of bandwidth to get one machine up in 72 hours. And that's about how much it took. And then the best part of this is it gives me the cost per DR per month and by component. And just to kind of validate this, I'll show you my cost over the last month in my test environment for the machines that I have as well. There's other tabs in here that show you and how many people are familiar with Azure and how Azure works, or AWS for that matter. Great. This will go in and tell you exactly what type of machine you want. It'll tell you what type of storage you need, how many disks, what type of capacity, what type of network capacity. It really is a good, solid footing for getting at least a precursor to the idea of the cost around using Azure. It'll tell you which VMs are compatible, which ones aren't, and there's a list of things that do and don't work up there, certain OSs. The nice thing that Microsoft's also done, this is a new product with Microsoft, so it's all in one document. You can just quickly go through and say, hey, I have a Red Hat machine with this version, or I have CentOS or Ubuntu. Does it work? And then it's just right there. And I didn't have any incompatible VMs. I have all my VMware tools installed, and I use Ubuntu. So, and then it gives me a better cost estimation on what type of connectivity I have. It tells me, you know, if I want to do this type of connection or VPN, how much it's going to cost to do the data transfers, and then it tells me all the VMs that I want to go ahead and run up there. And that cost that you saw on that first page, when it says it's $1,000 a month, actually also includes, if you see right here, the number of drills I did for a year. So this is a drill that I run where I go up to the cloud and say, hey, I want to turn on this environment. I want to run 6 of these a year, and I want to run them for a week long. So that $1,000 a month includes that drill time. So getting a lot of that out of the way, the cost really is the data to hold the capacity up there, and then $25 a month per VM if you're going to Azure, or $35 a month if you're going from one site to another. And yes, this will do one site to another, but it's out of scope of the conversation today, so it's a little bit more of an infrastructure. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the Azure cloud. This is my demo tenant. And I created a site recovery vault here. And before you say, hey, look, there's a lot of red on your screen, Joe, I purposely broke stuff so you could see what it looked like. I promise. As of about a month, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Microsoft actually reintroduced this new dashboard. So it'll tell you, hey, here's all the VMs I have. Here's how many are critical. Here's how many are healthy. They'll say, hey, we recommend running a test failover on this machine. And you can click on just about anything in here. And it'll say, hey, here's your test, it's healthy, and I haven't done a successful test failover. And I will go ahead and do one of those here in a minute. Get back to here. It'll give you an error list of, hey, here's this machine failed to replicate. Here's this machine has an app consistent recovery point, isn't available. And if we go back to that RPO and RTO conversation, every time we make a snapshot in our environments, there's really 2 types of snapshots we make. There's one that's just crash consistent, meaning, hey, I don't care what's running on here. I'm just going to take a quick snapshot of it and grab it. And the way you can usually tell that is when you power up that VM and you log in, Windows will say, hey, this machine wasn't shut down cleanly, what's up? An application consistent policy is something that we'll use with like SQL or more back-end databases where we say, hey, we're going to stop writing to the disks really quick. We're going to tell SQL, hey, we're going to make a quick, clean copy of everything, and then we make the backup copy. And I'll go into that a little bit as well. So for the demo here, I went ahead and created a VMware environment where I back up 3 machines. And you can tell I have one vCenter server, and then I have one infrastructure server, and that's that processing server I was talking about. And then I also have a Hyper-V environment that I went ahead and set up the agent on the Hyper-V machine and said, I just want to go ahead and back this one up. And when I mentioned Hyper-V is a little bit easier, it is from the fact that Microsoft's leveraging a lot of the tools they have in Hyper-V to do the Hyper-V replication. So Hyper-V replica service, and it uses all of that, and it treats Azure as a replica to Hyper-V. So it's pretty slick there. Hyper-V does allow you to also move those VMs back easier than VMware does, just as kind of a little bit of a warning. So I'm going to go ahead and click on a couple of these critical machines to kind of get a feel exactly what's going on in my environment. And so here I have an admin workstation that says it's protected, and I tested the failover maybe about a month ago, or a couple days ago, and it worked. And my biggest problem here is the machine is off. So when the machine is off, it will not back up those machines. It will only do active machines. The other one here, and if you guys have any questions anytime, feel free to stop me. I'm like a train, I get going. Had some caffeine this morning. This other machine, this machine named Market, it's going to have a failure here, and it says protection couldn't be enabled. And let me go back one here because it just gives a better error message. And depending on where you click, you get a different message. And so this one says, hey, this machine isn't being replicated. I can't find the service. Like, this is great. Let me find where this error message is. This other machine is actually a non-supported OS, so it's Windows 10 running as a VM. And so I wanted to make sure, because you often run stuff and you're like, well, Windows 10 and server are very similar guts. They specifically look for that. They do not want you backing up desktops. So XP, 7, Vista, 8, 8.1, 10 will not replicate back up into Azure Site Recovery. If you've got big Citrix environments or remote desktop environments, there are better ways to do that. So it was pretty easy to go ahead and set this up. And I won't talk a lot about setting up the Azure components, so your VPN, your network, all that, your storage. I went ahead and clicked Getting Started. And this is Site Recovery. And I want to go ahead and prepare my infrastructure. And where your machine's located. This does have an option to do Azure to Azure. And that cost is still the same as moving from on-prem to Azure. Where do you want to replicate them to? This is the functionality where you can go in and say, well, I want to go ahead and take this Hyper-V environment from my headquarters, and I want to replicate it out here, and I want Microsoft to handle the in-betweens. So if we don't have Commvault or Symantec or Zerto, Nutanix, things like that, this can do that functionality. And then it says, hey, where do I want my machines virtualized from? Am I using Hyper-V? Am I using something else? How many people still have physical, a pretty big physical, non-virtualized environment in their office? By a show of hands. Just a couple. But I hate to break it to you, it is a little bit harder with physical machines. So you can replicate them back up to Site Recovery, but you can't ever replicate back with a physical machine. So if you're trying to go to virtual, we most certainly can help you do that. There are lots of tools online to help you move those machines to virtual. And even if it's just a VM running on that exact same machine, there's nothing else there, that opens up the possibility for a lot more flexibility as far as disaster recovery with Azure. So, I'm going to go ahead and click VMware Hypervisor. And the first thing it's going to ask me is, did you run the planner? And it actually asks that everywhere in here. And so when I first started doing this, I just said, yeah, I'll do it later. But it's good to know from the perspective of, hey, I'm going to start replicating this data. How much bandwidth do I really need? How much data churn do I have if I'm replicating a bunch of web services, just a bunch of utility machines? How much data churns on there, and how long is it going to take me to try and hit my objective of 15 minutes? I already have a configuration server in place. So I'm just going to select that. This will also let you add more configuration servers or multiple vCenter hosts. So if you have a separate system for vCenter, say I'm doing something here for finance and I've got a different vCenter system for a different facility, it will handle all of that. And then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then you can specify your target, say, hey, what subscription do I want? What I want to use for Resource Manager or Classic. Please use Resource Manager. The Classic stuff's going to go away. And the portal is being deprecated as we speak this month, probably today. I knew it was the end of the month. And then it'll have you select a storage account in step 2. So some of this is already pre-populated for me. And that's the other thing too that you want to be careful of when you use that planner. It really helps out saying, hey, you've got 20 VMs. But in order to hit your performance levels that you're getting now, you probably need to have like 3 or 4 storage accounts. And so it will actually tell you that, hey, these storage accounts won't be able to suffice with what you're looking for. You need to make 2 or 3 or 4, and it'll help you. And it'll actually help you plan all that out. So I'm gonna go ahead and click cancel on this, and then it'll tell you replication settings. Actually, let me show you that one too. Replication settings, I can go ahead and pick a replication policy, and that'll say, hey, how many snapshots do I want to have? So how far back in time do I want to go, and how often do I want to take those snapshots? If it's every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour, and that's usually defined by cost and the business, how much downtime they're willing to take. So I'm going to close out on that. So I'm gonna go back up to my replicated items. There's that Minecraft server I was telling you about. So I'm gonna go ahead and I wanna go ahead and do a test failover really quick. I wanna see exactly how this system's gonna work. Now, and this is where a lot more planning comes in place as far as your design. If you go to your boss and say, hey, how much budget do we have? What type of failure do we want to protect against? Do we want to protect against a single machine? Say, hey, this motherboard burns out, or it's just dead. That affects a lot of the design of how you build your Azure environment right off the bat. In this scenario, I just assumed, hey, this is going to be like worst case scenario. Earthquake happens and our building's just sucked into the pits of hell. And so I set up our Azure network as a completely identical copy to the one I had on site, with the idea being, hey, this is going to be super bad. We're going to fail over here. We're not going to come back anytime soon. It had the lowest cost barrier entry. So the costs are the lowest, and I'll show you that here in a minute. My costs are less than $100 a month for 6 machines. And that's mostly because of data and the cost to actually back them up. And I should make mention too, if you're interested in looking at some of this, if you want to back up a machine, it's free the first month. And the trick is they don't track it across months. So if you want to back up a machine, mess with it for a month, go ahead and delete it, and then start backing it back up again as soon as your next cycle comes up. So you are going to copy that data back up there again, but it works perfectly. It's a side note. It's a very long trial, basically what I'm saying. Yep. So I'm going to go ahead. I click clean up, test failover on this machine, and here's where I can select what type of snapshot I have. Lowest RPO means it's the most recent, basically. The last processed would be the one that just got sent up, the most recent, because once data goes up there, it takes a little while for it to combine to build that VM. And then here's my app consistent one. So I'm gonna go ahead and choose the latest because it actually should be this one here in most scenarios. But let's say, for example, you've got some data corruption somewhere, and ideally it's not SQL, and you want to go ahead and revert back to a snapshot from a week or 2 ago or whatever. You can do that here. There are better tools for that. So VMware has some tools that you can use on-prem. Hyper-V has some stuff as well. You might have your backup product that works as well. But you can go ahead and do that here. And in this demo, I have one Azure network. It's going to throw a message saying, hey, this is actually the production network that matches your production network. For this test, you probably don't want to use this. And I'm okay because they're not actually connected right now. So I'm going to go ahead and fail this machine over. And you're going to get this status bar here. And while that's running, there's another item I want to talk about here. I'm spinning it up. It's called a test failover, and that was a good question. Eric mentioned you're not really failing over. you're just spinning up the test. I'm like, yes, that's correct. In an actual failover, and I can show you that because I'm not actually worried about this stuff, but let's go ahead and do this ASR test. I've actually never failed this one over because it says last successful test failover never performed. I'm going to go ahead and fail this over. And it says, hey, you've never actually tested this in the last 180 days. Do you care? No, I don't care. And then I'm going to go ahead and power it up. There were two boxes there, and let's go pull up another one so I can show you those again. We'll pick this one. And if you notice, this one's a little bit different. This says shut down machine before beginning failover. In this scenario, it realizes, hey, I have a connection back to my on-premise vCenter environment. Do you want me to shut down that one gracefully, sync the data up, and then bring it up in the cloud? Yeah, you can do that. It handles that type of failure over. It also handles a failover if it falls into the abyss. And Failback is also the same way. And I don't have the ability to tell you that, show you that today, but I can talk about it a little bit. So let's say I failed over my environment up to the cloud. There are several different ways we can always fail back. So in a vCenter environment, if that same system's there, I can go ahead, click here, and I can click reprotect and fail back. It will go ahead and take the data from Azure, replicate it back down to the on-premise VM, and then bring it back up online. Hyper-V works the same way. In the scenario that say this data center disappeared completely off the face of the earth, with Hyper-V, you're going to have to install the agents again, and it's basically like a reverse protection at that point. You're going to say, I want to protect this one, and I want to copy it back down here, and then you're going to bring this back up and then shut this stuff up here. So that scenario is not the best, but there's a way to recover from like a complete total outage. So this is going to go ahead and keep running in the background. Let's go back to our replicated items. And so here's my two, as I mentioned earlier, when you set up your environment and you say, hey, I want to make a recovery plan, I have two here. I have Hyper-V to Azure, and then I have all hell broke loose. So this is going to go ahead, and this gives me my source and my targets. If I go ahead and click settings on here and customize, and my notifications are in the way. This is actually a very lightweight run book. And so the idea of the conversation here today was, let's not talk about all the extra Microsoft stuff. Let's just get down to the basics, because the reality is Microsoft is really good at selling you something super basic like site recovery. And then you say, well, hey, I want to do some little bit more automation. Like, oh, that's an extra cost. So this is actually built in. This is partly automated. So let's say in a failover environment, or let's say like in a test failover, I can go ahead and set up this recovery plan. And I can say, you know what, there's these 6 machines. I want them to start up a certain way. Hey, I want my SQL to start up before my front ends or my middle tier, or I want my admin utility machine to start up first, so I can, go and configure the network or start remoting into machines. This all can be orchestrated from here. I can come up here and say, hey, I want to go ahead and fail over this group, this machine. I want to fail over this server, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can come in here as an admin. Oops, went too far, I apologize. I can come in here as an admin, click on my recovery plan, and then click test failover. Or in this scenario, when it actually occurs, you can do a full failover. Yes?
So you were talking about automation. That if a DR event takes place, this automatically kicks off, or are you saying like, something happens, I have to now find somewhere to get online to then kick this off?
Yeah. So the question was, hey, does this automatically fail over in a disaster, or do I have to go in and log and do some stuff? It can, but not with just the basic Azure Site Recovery. So ideally, let's say, and that's more of a business decision, right? Let's say if, like in my scenario where the power went on my data center, if we'd had some type of disaster recovery system, the business could have said, hey, how long is it going to take you to come back up from a power outage? If we said 4 hours, they could have said, great, let's just do that. Let's not fail over here, because the reality is once we fail over to the cloud, it's going to take another potential outage to come back on-prem. So within here, there's some small run books. You can say, hey, when I fail over, I want to fail over this block of stuff real quick. I don't have to go and click on every machine and click fail over, 40, 50 times or 10 times or whatever. When you start looking at the Azure Operations Manager, that's where you get into the big run books that you can put in monitors that say, hey, if I can't talk to my network or these 10 endpoints disappear, automatically fail them over and notify someone. And that's kind of out of scope. We can help you set that up, but it is a little bit more complex, and like with most Azure stuff, there's an additional charge for that. So
typically you need to go get online, come here, and take it.
yes, so yeah, so typically you would need to come online, come up here, find your recovery vault, and you can have multiples of those as well. And then you can either do it standalone like I did. I come up here and just click on each one of these and click failover, or you can make a recovery plan and then go ahead and run this and then fail it over completely.
Kind of like Office 360 admin, does Azure have a mobile application that you can potentially put on your phone to run this?
Yeah, so the question is, does Microsoft have a mobile app that will do this? I do not think so. So you have to come up to the web. Yeah, it is. This is pretty responsive. Unfortunately, the blades don't work out very well on a phone. They're still really bad. I mean, if you can see my screen, it still barely works out on your screen sometimes. So, but yeah, so good question. And so, and actually, back to the Microsoft Operations Manager, you can automate some of that, where you could set up to where you can send an email to a mailbox or something, and it'd kick off that workflow. So there's a lot of power in their automation component using Azure, but not just in the base site recovery. So if if you're pitching us to your manager, you say, hey, we can back up a machine, and let me show you my subscription here. Here's my Visual Studio Enterprise one that I've used for this. This is for the last month. I have five machines up there, and I'm not paying for site recovery yet because it's in the trial, but it would be $25 for each machine. My biggest cost here is $657, and that's actually my VPN gateway. That's not even so, and that's the other thing too that's really nice about this. You don't pay for sending data to Azure. You only pay for when it comes out. The other cost here is, you can see, admin workstation test and a physical machine test. I left those machines on accident overnight. Yeah, cost me 10 cents, right? And so site recovery covers the backup of your VMs to the cloud, but it doesn't cover running them. The minute you click failover or test failover, they power up, and you're using compute and storage and network just like any other VM. And that's where you need to start watching your costs. And so, like back in my case, if we would have said, hey, we need to fail over to Azure, this is how much it's going to cost to run, the business could have said, well, it costs us $1 million every 10 minutes. Screw that, we'll take care of that later. We need to sell our product. Go, 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 And if you guys are familiar with this, it gives me the subscription to tell me my forecast for how much I'm spending at this rate through the month. You can click here, you can break it down. I'll go ahead and click here really quick and pull it up. So you can see other classic resources. This is my VPN gateway. I have 0 charge for transfer in. So you can send terabytes and terabytes of data up to site recovery. And the only thing you're going to be paying for, and if you look up here, here's my storage account, I have 71 cents charged. Microsoft's pretty inexpensive when it comes to storage, to be completely honest. It's a little bit more costly when you actually start to run stuff up there. So this is a great scenario for if hey, I've got 3 machines, I just want to protect them, or if I've got a remote site, we don't want to spend money on our backup product or a tape vault or a library or whatever out there. We can set this up on a Hyper-V machine out in the middle of nowhere, back up 3 machines, and they're just always there. You do also have the ability to say, hey, I really don't want to restore them. Like if this site disappears, I just want to get the VMs, you can always go download them and then reload them somewhere else. That's a complete option.
Is this a direct billing from Microsoft, or can this get both inside
It's a good question. The question was, is this a direct billing or can it get rolled into EA? It can do both. So this is just a standard subscription. And if your subscription's through your EA, like you're required to have a certain amount of spend with your contract, it'll just roll into that. You spend it, you create a new subscription, assign it to an account, and you're done. Oh, was there one over here?
Yeah, I was just curious what this service, if it's an a la carte thing, you can plug into what you're currently doing and what that cost is, or if it's just straight what you're using, what you're doing, it's available, but what you're using it for is what you go for.
Yeah, good question. So is this a la carte or what am I using when I'm getting billed for? Microsoft is super huge on like the gateway drug, right? So it's, hey, go ahead and use Azure and why not just try a VM? We'll give you $150 this first month. So, and that's another, that ties into that as well. If you want to try this out, go create an Azure account with your personal email. They give you like $100 the first month. Go at it. This actually, and I tied this together specifically this way so I could track all of my costs. So I took one of my Visual Studio Enterprise licenses, subscriptions, and I get like $150 a month with that subscription. And I said, everything I build for Azure Site Recovery, I want to build back to that subscription. So this includes VPN from my network to Azure. It includes the storage account. It includes the site recovery license when I start getting charged for it here in a couple days. Everything's under that subscription. So you can break it out however you want. If you want it to be on a different network that's in a different subscription that gets billed somewhere else, you're free to do that. And then you can isolate just the site recovery cost to a subscription. So does that answer your question? Sort of? Okay.
So just to clarify that point, there's the $25 per machine plus whatever services are stored.
Yeah.
And then you turn.
Yep. Eric brought up a good point. So it is $25 a VM a month and whatever additional costs on top of that. So data out, your VPN connection, storage, and that's how it's broken out here. I don't have any of these site recovery costs for the actual licenses itself in my tenant yet because I haven't crossed that 30-day threshold on my VMs. So this is just all the other underlying usage, which hasn't been very much. And this has been running for about almost a month now. And like I said, the VPN's the most expensive part out of this whole thing. When you go back and look at it, it's the gateway that costs more. So if you're already using Azure for something else and you have a couple other VMs in there, you already have a gateway. And so that cost is already kind of offset by some other department, and just piggyback on that and get it up there. Like I said, there's no cost to get the data up there. So you can back up as much as you want to get it up there, but you will pay for holding it up there. Yeah, data doesn't, so Eric also wanted me to mention that data does not go through VPN, it goes straight out to the cloud. So it's all encrypted, hits Azure, and then they'll store it for you. Yeah, you do not need to have a VPN tunnel built for this. You will need it for those scenarios where if you want your sites to come back online, things like that. But yeah, you don't need it for this. So I went ahead and failed over these machines. And right now it's successfully failed over. Yep, so I'm gonna go ahead and log in into that machine. And I'm using that VPN tunnel for all this, so my machine's connected up there. And ideally, if everything worked as planned, my kids' Minecraft server should be just where they are at that last snapshot, which should have been 15 minutes ago, right? And as you can see, it's licenses, you most likely have this benefit where you can say, hey, this was a VM on-prem. I can go ahead and run it up in Azure without paying for the license. And they take that license cost off the VM. So as you can tell, I came through here and clicked yes, because that saves like 40% of the cost of the VM. So let me go here and show you what that looks like. Let's say this admin workstation, I've decided, hey, this SQL workload or this IIS web server, we're in a crippled state. I want to go ahead and run it with less resources up in the cloud. I don't want the 16 cores and 80 gig of RAM that I gave it down here. It only needs 4, right? We overspec this VM way past the moon. I'm going to go ahead in here, and on the right, here's the properties for this VM. It'll give me information such as like, here's the health, here's my data change, daily change rate. So you can come in here and say, hey, how much data churn has happened on this machine in the last 24 hours? It'll tell you its address on network, how many disks are attached. It'll tell you the failover properties as far as like, hey, this is the size that I end up using. This is a burstable VM. And when the last successful test of the network was, or the failover. I'm going to go ahead and click on Compute and Network now for this VM. And I should mention, all this can be done through PowerShell or through the API. You don't have to do this manually. Just for the sake of use, I had 5 VMs. Like, you know what? I can configure 5 VMs. It's not going to kill me. I can go ahead and pick the name of when it's up in Microsoft Azure. There are some things that don't carry over very well. So the on-premises name is actually the name in vCenter. If I've got spaces, Azure doesn't like spaces. If I've got an underscore or things like that, Azure doesn't like underscores either. So it's named and dashes. So for the sake of this, I went and actually just renamed it on-prem. Best practice would probably be to make a match. I can change the resource group. So let's say if I've got separate subscriptions for different departments or whatever, however Failback is, this VM gets paid by finance. I can come here and say this, it actually goes to finance. And so when they get their subscription from themselves to pay the bill, their VM cost for backing it up and keeping it, the DR is already there. I can come in and change the size. I can say, you know what, that machine, that B2 is way too high end for Minecraft. I'm gonna go ahead and give it 1 core and less than 1 gig of memory. One of the features that's really nice, that's new as well, use managed disks. In the past, it was a non-managed disk, so you'd run into constraints as far as, hey, what if I need to grow? What if the performance isn't there? Do I have to manage all that junk? So managed disk basically means that Microsoft handles a lot of that for you. If this machine needs to grow, you can go and just resize it and you're done. It's the way they're pushing all of their stuff. So they've added the option in here for managed disks. Highly recommend just click yes. You can do your failover test and delete it, and it doesn't touch the managed disk. But as soon as you click, hey, we're going to go live active here, it's going to use that managed disk. It makes your life 100% easier. I can go ahead and click the network that's going to fail over to. If you've got complex networks, 10, 20, 30 different networks, and you want to make sure it gets in the right subnet, like in my scenario, I want to give it the exact same IP address it had on-prem. I can come in here and say, well, I have this network that matches home. I can come in here and give it a static IP address to match exactly what it was on-prem, or I can just use dynamic. And then you can also add other interfaces if you need to. And then here's the hybrid use benefit here. They hide this all the way down at the very bottom of the VM. You can't just turn it on at the subscription and say, yeah, we're good. You have to come into each of the VMs or use PowerShell and click yes here. And what that does is as soon as the machine powers up and you're actually using it for a failover test, it drops the cost of running the VM up in the cloud. Yes, thanks. So Eric brought up, when you're running Azure in the cloud, when you subscribe and purchase a VM up there and you say, I want Windows 2012 R2 or 2016, the cost of running that VM that Microsoft gives you as a line item includes the license. And the reason they do that is, hey, I'm a new user, I don't have any Microsoft products, I just want to run a VM. You can go up there, you can purchase the VM, and it includes all that. You get one line item cost in the subscription saying, hey, this is the VM. The The hybrid use benefit basically just says, you know what, I don't want to pay for that license in that cost. Take it off the line item. Yeah, a little bit of an honor system. Here's my disks. It'll give me the status of each of the disks. It'll say, here's the target, here's my last sync. This is how much I've transferred. And it's pretty straightforward there. I wanted to get into one other thing too, is if we go to set this up, and when I talked about Microsoft, this being a new product with Microsoft, it really is. All of your site recovery documentation is at one spot. And they give you a couple of quick 5-minute starts, quick start videos. You can go through and start protecting your VMs if you want to do it. There's tutorials, there's concepts as far as how to design your infrastructure, what you need, the concept of a configuration server and process server. When I went and set up my tenant, I said, hey, look, let's just run through the quick scenario. Let's set this up really quick. It took me maybe 30 minutes, and I had a machine replicating up into the cloud. It's that easy from this perspective. Now, if you have nothing up in Azure and you look at the quick start, you're going to say, whoa, I have no idea what some of this stuff is. There's a little bit of a setup time. You're going to set up your network. You want to set up your subscription in Azure. Get an Azure account, right? But for the most part, it's pretty easy to run through here. There's some how-to guides, and they've even made it easier for VMware users now. They provide an OVF template of 2016 preloaded with all their tools. So if you've got a VMware environment, you can go up there, download the OVF, import it in, give it a network interface. You'll need to install PowerCLI 6.0. They do not support anything else other than PowerCLI 6.0, by the way. I learned that the hard way. Went and installed 6.5, and it's like, hey, I can't find it. I'm like, no, it's there, trust me. All your little tweaks to make it look like it was there, didn't work. So 6.0. There's the deployment planner tool. And it gives you the guidance of how to run it. It tells you basically how to run it, gives you all the switches. It'll give you examples. You can say, hey, these machine names, just put them in a text file, look at this text file, and tell me how much data transfer I'm gonna have to do to get these 6 machines up there. You can do one machine, you can do them all. It's very granular that way. And then it'll go ahead and generate that report like I had right here. The other thing this report will do, once it gets spit out, you can change your desired RPO. And they're working on this constantly. So you'll notice that when you start playing around with this, some of it will break because it's very macro heavy. Just close it and reopen it. Don't save it. Yeah, don't save it unless you have another copy, because they're working on this a lot. That tool gets updated every month or so. And it's actually to a point now where that tool is the same tool you use for hyperware and VMware. In the past, you'd have to go and download a different client for VMware. It was very GUI driven, very heavy, whereas this is, you don't even need to install it. You just extract the files and click run, and you're on your own. I mentioned earlier too is the support matrix for Azure Site Recovery. This will tell you, hey, what VMware environment it supports, whether it supports Virtual Machine Manager or not, and it does in Hyper-V. For the simplicity's sake, I did standalone Hyper-V, and you can do it that way too. Just install the agents on all your Hyper-V machines. The downside with that is it doesn't follow the VM when it migrates across hosts. So in a Hyper-V scenario, if you've got a failover cluster and you've got that agent on all of them, it won't follow it. So you have to go and reprotect it. With a Virtual Machine Manager, you can just point it there and it'll follow it as it moves throughout your cluster. Here's the supported OSs. It'll tell you, and it does get kind of weird too, because with Linux, and Microsoft's getting better at this, it has certain generic kernels that it'll support between each version. And so I did a quick test just to see how bad it really was. I installed a kernel that was supported, started protecting it, and then moved to one that wasn't, and it was still protecting fine. So it really comes down to when you decide to call it Microsoft saying, hey, something broke, why is this not working? They'll tell you, no, it's a non-supported kernel, if they even get to that point. I mentioned physical machines, they are a little bit more difficult to move. You still can migrate them to Azure for Site Recovery Manager. It uses the same process that you would use for VMware. So you'll install their process server on-prem and then point it at those machines and give it an account to connect to it. There are some caveats to what it does and doesn't support. And that also applies to VMs. So VMs, for example, it supports teaming on the Hyper-V level and on the vCenter ESX level, but it won't support it in the VM. So if you've got 4 network adapters in a VM teamed, it won't support that. It won't support shared disk between VMs. So if you've got a SQL cluster, highly available cluster that's sharing disks in your virtual environment, it won't support migrating that. The Microsoft does actually have other products to do SQL disaster recovery. Was there a question over here? Okay. Other storage you'll support, and it's pretty much the same here. They support if you store your stuff on NFS or iSCSI, Fiber Channel on both, and then SMB on Hyper-V. The disk, so Eric asked, what's the disk size limits? There's no disk size limits as far as what you're pulling the data from. The disk size limits are all controlled by Azure. So if you've got a 6 terabyte SQL database on a single VM, you want to move up there. Right now, I think the limit is 2 terabytes. Yeah, and that's on the Azure side. And what I'll do is, before we send out the PowerPoint, I'll send out Azure VM limitations as well in there. Yes?
But with a situation like that, you did say that Azure could handle like being the middleman and help to facilitate if you were going to store it someplace else that maybe didn't have those limitations?
Good question. So I mentioned earlier, the question was, if let's say you're just going to replicate from site to site, well, is there a limitation there? There is not a limitation there. Yes, it's more of a limitation on their virtual environment at this point. So, and I'll talk about that for a minute. So let's say if you want to go ahead and do site to site, I want to do from one vCenter system to another vCenter system, and I don't want to do data protection, VMware data protection. I want to use this. The product that the Microsoft purchased was called Scout, and you're basically installing another on-prem backup system at that point. You're going to go ahead and install it. They have a lot of documentation around it, and it uses Azure as the proxy to get to that other system. When you do go down that route, if you want to do site to site, the VMs are more fluid back and forth, meaning I can go from this Hyper-V environment back to this Hyper-V environment. If you want to do the disaster scenario where this one burns to the ground, it's all running here, it follows that same type of process Azure does. Well, now I've got to go and reset up this system. I've got to go and say, I want to protect these, and I'll replicate them back here, and then we'll fail over when it's done. So if you go down that route. Like I said before too, if you're doing physical machines, you can fail up to the cloud, you can't fail back from that point. So it's really a one-way ticket if you're on a physical machine. Yeah, you get the benefit of being in the cloud. There's no such thing as stuck with Microsoft, right? And so back to my VMs, it should have, my VMs are still running. I'm gonna go ahead and look at them really quick. Here's my Minecraft test server. I've gone through now, I've tested it, it's working. My kids can connect to Minecraft. The crisis has been averted. I wanna go ahead and get rid of this failover, this test environment. I can go ahead and go back to my Azure Site Recovery, and I pick my recovery vault, and then I'm going to go ahead and click this machine, which I remember where it was. Yeah, there's like 10 ways to get to everything in here, right? I'm going to click my Minecraft server, and I'm going to go ahead and clean up test failover. So there's a notes section here. I can't find out where the notes go. So you guys know. Couldn't find it. I'm like, where do these notes go? No documentation. Have no idea where that note goes. I'm sure it's in a log somewhere. So I can go ahead and click testing is complete, delete failover virtual machines. If I don't click that, the machine's going to stay there. And it looks like they now make it so you have to click it. All right, great. And it's going to go ahead and clean that up. It's going to delete those disks. It'll remove that network adapter and dump it completely. This interface, and to tell you how fast Microsoft's going with this right now, this interface, when I set up this environment, this was not here. So beginning of January, woke up one morning, checking out my backups, making sure everything's good. It popped in. I'm like, sweet, this is awesome. Yesterday, Microsoft blogged about it, saying, hey, this is here. Everything's context driven, so I can click on just about anything in here, and it'll pop up either the error message or the machine or the problem. This chart is super awesome because this wasn't here either. That was the first question I had when I started setting this up, is like, okay, how am I going to navigate easily between the systems, right? When you're doing a presentation, like, I want to get from here to here real quick. And the Blade doesn't have that capability real easily, right? I've got them come through here and click here. Well, now they've got this. So if you're presenting it to your manager or to someone on the business side and they want to see the status, they can come in here and say, great, everything's good except for, oh, by the way, here, no mobility service, heartbeat, one virtual machine, upload blocked. And that's my machine that is Windows 10. It will not replicate. It gives you the status of, hey, I can't connect to my storage pool, or hey, the site recovery is having an outage. And I did notice that earlier there's a little bit of a blip on the site recovery earlier this month, and I noticed there's a little red line coming through there, so there was a problem. And another great question that I saw online was, hey, what happens if site recovery does go down? So if that little blob right here tanks, this storage account is just like any other Microsoft Azure storage account. You can go grab your data out of it. You can go through the browser, and I'll show you really quick. If I remember how to get there. I'm going to go ahead and pick up my storage account, and I named it ASR for site recovery. I can come in here and click on my blob, and then each one of these will have, and that's not it. Let's see. Click on the wrong one. And then here's my VHD from one of my backups. I can go and grab these. So you can get your data back. Yeah.
A big part of the sales pitch, if we're going to pitch to the business, is making sure Microsoft's got skin in the game. Are there ever times where they will offer credits or reimburse for service failures, storage failures, feature failures?
You know what? That's a good question. Does Microsoft provide credits if there's an issue up in the cloud? They used to. I don't know if they still do on the site recovery stuff. So it used to be, right, to get your workload up there, if there was an outage below like 5 nines or 6 nines of uptime, meaning we only had an outage of maybe an hour a year, we'd give you credit for that time. I don't think they do anymore. Do you know?
I thought they did, but I would have to go look at it.
Yeah, I have to go look. And they could offer it for all the other components of the site recovery except for site recovery. So we'll just have to, I can go check and we can get back with you on that. Yes?
If you're uploading your data from your VMs or whatever you're storing for their failure, does it give you the options for you to specify what basically cluster, like East Coast, West Coast, of where it's storing?
Yes. So that is all tied into, sorry, the question is if I want to go ahead and specify where this is going, can I go east or west? I selected that before I started. Before I start protecting these. So when I go and protect a VM, actually, let me see if I can show you here. I went ahead and picked it's on premise. It's from VMware. It's a virtual machine or physical. That's where the physical stuff comes in. Here's my vCenter host. That's where I can select multiple vCenter hosts. And the process server, which in my case is the source location. And a lot of this is also tied to your storage pool as well. So, and I may have done that when I did my storage pool. So here's my resource group, and then my failover is resource manager. So you can select it. So I had, before I built this environment, recently, I had one a couple months ago where I had VMs going to 2 different storage sites. It's a little bit more complex because it ties back to the storage pool as well, but you can definitely do that. You can also definitely do it to different storage performance tiers, different subscriptions, and the other one will lose me. Sorry, I don't know where I was going with that. Oh, yeah, there's another question.
I'm just curious. Escalation process. Like when we have this site scenario, failover scenario, these sensitive scenarios, and someone out there, of course, when there is no problem, you go there, bring that backup, and do it. But there are some, we don't know some scenarios, some cloud center is down, this center is down, this is not available. I want someone that immediately guide me. So is that is Azure that's not a separate support thing, or is it the same thing as what you do for OpenShift?
So you're asking for support on like site recovery, right?
Right.
It's a good question. So let's say we do have a disaster, is Microsoft there to help you? They are there to help you, and depending on your subscription level, they will assist you to a point. If you're basic subscription with Microsoft, it's a call or an email. And that's where kind of Journey Team steps in. We can help you set up a run book to kind of figure out exactly how you're going to handle this disaster scenario, what type of data you're going to protect, how to fail over. So we give you steps saying, hey, let's say this site does go down. It's a remote site. What are the scenarios we go through to bring it back up here, and how do we get it back is the more important thing, like you suggested. Microsoft won't necessarily, their professional service will help you set some of that up, but we most certainly can help you that as well. And if you're interested in that, you can talk to Brian or one of the other sales guys, and they can help you out. Yeah, so Eric also mentioned the availability of Azure. Azure does have a site you can go to and check availability, just like Amazon does. You can see the status of each service. So you can look at your storage pools, you can look at the compute side for your region. And so they have that as well. Is there any other questions? Yes.
So if you choose to store it on the West Coast, does Microsoft actually replicate that outside of the West Coast? Say North Korea decides to move to the West Coast. Should we somehow live in Utah?
Yeah, good question. So
do we need to pick two, or is there some replication going on anyway?
yeah, so good question. So the question was, does Microsoft replicate your data anywhere else? And yes, they do. And actually part of that is also up to you as well. So you can define if it's locally redundant or geo-redundant across your storage pool. And so that's actually outside of site recovery. So you can say, hey, if I'm using US West 2 and I want to replicate it somewhere else like Central US or East 1, you can do that. And that's an option in site recovery and also on your storage account. So that's the other thing that also ties back into costs with Microsoft. They'll replicate your data anywhere you want it to, but there's a cost associated with it. So at bare minimum, they make sure that they don't lose your data, so they'll replicate it at least one place, but it's local. It'll be local redundant, so they call it LRO. So it's most likely if it's in US West 1 or 2, they'll put it somewhere else closer to that region versus shipping it all the way across the country. Is there any other? Go ahead.
With AWS, we have issues where the service versions are different between the different regions, and so that provides certain limitations.
You're not alone, AWS buddy. You're not alone. Yeah. So the question was: is service availability across Azure are the same service available everywhere? No, they are not. The difference with Microsoft versus AWS is in the AWS environment, you have to go and click the drop down to see your separate regions. With Microsoft, it's all in one portal. So if you look back at my VMs, I could technically have all 4 of those VMs on 4 different storage pools in 4 different regions and restore to 4 different networks in 4 different regions. So it's all from one pane of glass versus like in AWS, I have to go and click Virginia or US West or Oregon or whatever and switch between them. The limitation really, and this is kind of outside site recovery, but the limitation really between AWS and Azure is more on a subscription-based level. So let me go back to my screen here. So as part of my replication of my 5 VMs, it determined I needed 46 cores, and that's a subscription level setting. By default, Microsoft says any subscription can have 20 cores. So you can either do two things. You can either split your machines up across subscriptions, which is a little bit more painful, or you can contact Microsoft and increase your core count. So it's similar but different is really what it boils down to. And a lot of it's architecture, a lot of it's where you want to be billed. So does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Great. Like I said, I put a whole bunch of links in the PowerPoint. There's a little bit of information about the site recovery planner, and then the links that I found useful. This is the Azure blog. If you click on that, it'll post back to the new UI and the OVF. But it's a good blog to follow because you either find out about stuff in Azure because you're using it, or because you stumble across the blog, or you stumble across a problem. Here's Microsoft's fluff marketing links. If it does give you some costs, you can go there and it'll give a high level on the product. And then here's the Azure Advantage to some other point solutions. So I happen to use like Zerto and Commvault in the past, and some Nutanix. I really like those products, but there's always some caveat to using those in your environment. So feel free to give Azure a try. If you're interested, you can contact us. We'd be glad to come out and at least help you kind of figure out what your costs would be and run that planner for you. Oh, yes, and we have a survey being sent out. Feel free to respond back to that. We will post this webinar for you as well as the PowerPoint. And if you have any questions, you can email me or Eric directly. Be glad to help you out. So thanks for coming. Hopefully the food was the high point of the last hour and a half. And if only you could get to justify the travel expense to your boss, right? We'd be completely good. So. It was Zupa's. It was Zupa's, right? I'm not the best to look at. That's really what it boils down to. So.
I was on the webinar. It was nice.
Oh, good. You didn't see me. See, perfect. You didn't see me.